The morning they led the first goat off the trailer, half of Sutter's Crossing came out to watch, and not one of them brought encouragement. They brought coffee and commentary, which is a different thing entirely. A woman named Della Marsh stood at the edge of the county road with a lead rope in her hand and 43 goats behind her, and the town assessed her the way towns assess a thing they have already decided upon. The land at her back was 70 acres of blackberry cane, so thick and so old the vines had swallowed a building whole. You could see the roof line, just barely, like the top of a man's hat sticking up from a flooding river. That was all. That was the farm. $300 at auction, a deed with her name on it, and 70 acres of thorns hiding whatever lay underneath. 3 years earlier, a voice would tell you if you asked, "Before we get to the mourning of the goats, you need to understand what she was walking into and why she walked in anyway. You need to understand the auction and the land, and the particular arithmetic Della Marsh did in the dark of a rented room the night before she raised her paddle. Della was 26 years old when she bought the 70 acres. She had come to Sutter's Crossing the previous autumn with a second-hand wagon, $90 tucked into the lining of her coat, and no family within 3 states to ask for help or permission. She had been working Mr. Aldrich's dairy for room and a small wage, which means she had been waking at 4 in the morning and going to bed when the work was finished, which was generally never. She had no objection to this schedule. She had been raised to it. What she objected to was the arithmetic, which, no matter how she ran the figures, showed that she would still be in Mr. Aldrich's barn in 20 years if something did not change. She was a methodical person by nature, the kind who counts things automatically, who notes the direction a cloud is moving before most people have looked up to see the sky. She had been watching Sutter's Crossing for months before the auction notice went up in the post office window, and what she had been watching most carefully was the land nobody talked about. The land people talk about is priced accordingly. The land nobody talks about is something else. The 70 acres east of the Platte Road, cut, had been in the Hennessy estate for 30 years. Old Hennessy had died without a will and with considerable debt, and his heirs, scattered as far as Ohio, had finally agreed on the only thing heirs ever agree on when there is nothing left to divide except the trouble of a thing. They would sell it. The county assessor's notice described it as, in his particular bureaucratic poetry, agriculturally marginal. That was a polite way of saying it was buried. Rubus alleghaniensis, Himalayan blackberry, thorned cane that grew 10 feet high and sent roots down 3 feet, and lateral runners 6 feet in a single season. The cane had taken the pasture first, then the lane, then the 2 outbuildings, and finally whatever the main structure had been. 40 years of unmolested growth. 3 men had bid before Della, and each one had stepped back as the price climbed toward $300, because $300 for 70 acres of blackberry cane with a hidden building in the middle of it was, by any reasonable measure, an extravagance. Della raised her paddle. The gavel came down. She walked the perimeter that same afternoon, alone, in boots she'd borrowed from the Aldrich farm, because her own were not yet adequate for what she was entering. The cane was taller than her head at the boundary, and taller still at the center. She found the edges of a fieldstone foundation buried to the first course. She found a rusted hinge that had once been a gate. She found at the low southeast corner, where the ground dipped and held water, a seep spring that trickled clean and cold even in October, and she crouched beside it for a long time without saying anything, because a person does not announce a thing like that. A person remembers it. She also found old-growth blackberry cane with root masses the size of a man's torso, and she understood immediately that neither a plow, a scythe, nor human hands working any number of seasons would clear it before the debt consumed her. She sat at the edge of the seep spring, and she thought. This was a thing she was constitutionally capable of doing for a long time without visible result, and it unsettled people who preferred action to look at her. but the thinking was the action, as her grandmother had been fond of telling her. And in the end, the thinking produced what it always produced, a calculation and a plan. She had been watching the McNulty place for 2 seasons. Old Pavel McNulty had come from Bohemia 30 years before with a specific and transferable knowledge, and what he had was a small herd of goats that had grown over time to a number that slightly exceeded his ability to manage them. He sold kids in the spring. He was 71 years old and walked with a cane himself, and he was the only person in Sutter's Crossing who, when he heard about the auction, had not laughed. He had nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a plan he has thought through himself is finally arriving in the hands of someone who can execute it. She went to see him that same evening. He was sitting on his porch with a cup of something steaming and the particular stillness of a man who has lived long enough to stop filling silences unnecessarily. She told him what she had found, the acreage, the cane, the spring, the foundation. He listened without interrupting, which was the thing she valued most about him. When she was finished, he looked at the middle distance for a while, and then he said, "Goats do not see a problem. They see a meal." And then, after another silence, "Land is not what it looks like. Land is what it is capable of, and you cannot know that until you have taken off what does not belong there." He rose from his chair. "Come, I will show you which ones." She could not afford 43 goats. This requires clarification. She purchased 4 that autumn from Pavel at a fair price, 2 does and 2 young wethers, and she made an arrangement for the rest. She would manage Pavel's overflow herd, graze them on her land, starting in spring, in exchange for the use of their labor and a share of the kids come summer. This was not charity on Pavel's part, and both of them knew it. His fence lines had been overrun for 2 years. His knees would not allow what needed doing. The arrangement was clean. She spent the winter doing the things that needed doing before the goats could do their work. She repaired 3 sections of fence along the county road using cedar posts she split herself from a downed tree at the far end of the property. She built a 3-sided shelter from salvage lumber she hauled from the ruins of the old outbuilding once she had cut enough cane back to reach it by hand. She worked from first light until she lost the light, and she returned to the Aldrich place in the dark and rose again at 4 for the dairy work, and the town, on the occasions when it noticed her at all, called her stubborn and eccentric, which were the words it used for a young woman doing something it did not understand and could not easily stop. By April, when Pavel helped her walk the full herd down the Platte Road and onto her land, Della Marsh had not told a single person in Sutter's Crossing about the spring or about the Fieldstone Foundation or about what she had begun to suspect lay beneath the cane at the center of the property. She had told Pavel, who received the information with the same deliberate calm with which he received all information. "You keep a coal banked low under ash," he told her. "You do not blow on it before it is caught." She understood this. She had been banking things all her life. The goats understood their work with an enthusiasm that bordered on personal affront to the Blackberry cane. 43 animals turned loose in the first 20 acres made a sound on the first morning that could only be described as industrial. They stripped cane. They pulled runners. They dug at root crowns with their front hooves and then consumed whatever they had unearthed, thorns included, with an indifference to pain that Della found genuinely admirable. She moved them in rotations she had worked out on paper over the winter, block by block, 8-day cycles that kept them on fresh cane before they overgrazed any section and poisoned the ground they would eventually need to be productive. She learned their preferences. She learned which ones led and which ones followed, and which one, a small black doe with improbable ears, was the decisive opinion of the herd. She had not named them initially. Then a boy named Tobias Fenn, who was 11 years old and whose family's place bordered hers on the west, began appearing at the fence line after school, and the naming problem resolved itself with the unstoppable momentum of an 11-year-old who has decided something is his business. He named the black doe Sunday. He named the rest of them on a system Della never fully decoded, though she suspected it involved the contents of a book of saints' names he had borrowed from the Sutter's Crossing lending library and not returned. She let it stand. She was not sentimental about the names, but she was practical about the boy, who turned out to have a genuine instinct for the animals and an uncanny ability to find a goat that had gotten through a fence, which was a talent worth cultivating. June arrived and the first 20 acres came clear. Not clean, not yet. The root crowns needed 2 more passes, and the ground needed turning before it would be plantable, but clear enough to walk without fighting. The cane was gone from the surface, and the goats had done it in 9 weeks. Della stood at the edge of the cleared section in the early morning and looked at the ground and the light coming flat and gold across it, and she permitted herself a single minute of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Then she moved the herd to the second section and went back to work. People noticed the cane coming down, of course. Sutter's Crossing was not a large town. A man named Horace Greer, who ran the grain and feed on the main street and had a particular investment in knowing what was happening with any agricultural project within 5 miles, appeared at her fence line in July. He wore his assessment on his face, which was the face of a man trying to calculate a number he has not been given permission to see. He asked her what she intended to plant once the land was clear, and she told him she had not decided yet, which was true in the way that a thing can be true and also quite incomplete. He told her, with the particular warmth of a man delivering bad news he is quietly pleased to deliver, that that land had clay subsoil that would compact into something not far from brick in a dry summer, and that anyone who thought they could grow a crop on it without expensive tiling was going to be disappointed. She thanked him. He left. The goats kept eating. It was Pavel who told her about the depot. She had begun to suspect it. The foundation stones were too evenly laid for a farmhouse, the spacing too wide, the remnant of a platform edge she had found at the center of the property too deliberate. But it was Pavel who remembered. The Platte Road cut, he told her, had originally been surveyed as a spur line. The railroad had committed to it in 1879, the depot had been built, and then the main line had shifted 12 miles north, and the depot had stood empty from 1882 onward, and then the cane had grown up, and then the memory of it had grown over too. It is a thing that happens to places, he said. They disappear, and people stop arguing with their disappearance. Della walked to the center of her land with a folding rule and spent an afternoon measuring stone. The building was 40 feet long and 18 wide, built from the same fieldstone as the foundation walls, with a roof that had partially held because the cane itself had supported it from below. She spent 2 weeks with a pry bar and a handsaw, cutting cane from the interior and pulling the vines from the walls, and when the last of the interior cane came down, she stood in the middle of an 1882 railroad depot in excellent structural condition and looked at the roof, which had 4 small holes the size of her hand, and otherwise was sound, and she said something she had not been planning to say, which was simply, quietly, "There it is." She did not say it to anyone else for another month. She banked the coal. The second section cleared in August, which arrived like the open door of a furnace, and stayed. The heat was bad, but the goats were indifferent to it as long as the water held, and the spring held all summer, steady and cold, which was a thing that Della had calculated and Horace Greer had not known to calculate. By the end of August, the herd had cleared 40 acres. 40 acres of blackberry cane gone, the ground beneath it exhausted and torn and full of thorn root, but real, accessible, and hers. The roof was repaired. The depot walls had been repointed where the mortar had crumbled. She had found beneath the depot floor, under a half-inch of compacted dirt, the original oak floorboards, black with age but intact, and she had spent a week cleaning them. She had not decided yet what the depot would become. She had several ideas, and she turned them slowly, the way a person turns a thing in the light to see all sides of it. It was a traveling salesman named Cecil Birch who found the farm before Sutter's Crossing decided to. He came down the Platte Road in September with a wagon full of dry goods and a broken trace that needed mending, and he stopped at her fence and watched the goats working the third section and said he had not seen a land-clearing operation like this in 30 years of roads. He asked her how many acres they had done. 40, she told him. He asked her how long. 5 months. He was quiet for a moment. He climbed down from his wagon, introduced himself properly, and asked her if she sold kids in the spring, because he had a cousin in Leavenworth who had been trying to find a reliable source of milking does. She said she might, and he wrote the cousin's name and address on a slip of paper and gave it to her. And before he left, he said, not unkindly, that she had done something genuinely interesting with a piece of ground he had watched sit useless for 20 years. Interesting was a word that paid no bills, but she noted it. You note the first one. By the third week of October, the goats had cleared 55 of the 70 acres, and Della let herself do the full arithmetic for the first time. The cleared land could carry a small permanent herd year-round. The spring would support it. The depot could be made into a proper goat dairy. The dimensions were right, the stonework was sound, the floor was level. She had already written to the cousin in Leavenworth, and the reply had come back with an order for 8 milking does at a price that made her read the letter twice to be certain. There was also the question of the kid crop come spring, which, if the winter breeding went well, and she pushed the number to 50 animals, would produce somewhere between 30 and 40 kids to sell. She ran the numbers 3 times in a row, sitting at the small table in her rented room at the Aldrich place, and came up with the same answer each time, which was that she was going to be solvent. Not comfortable, not wealthy, but solvent, free. This was the moment that Horace Greer chose to become interested. It is a law as reliable as weather. The moment a thing begins to be worth something, the men who dismissed it find reasons to have been involved all along. Greer came to her at the end of October. He had a business proposition, he said. He had heard she was moving toward a dairy operation, and as the feed merchant in the county, it only made sense for them to come to an arrangement. He could supply her grain and hay at a preferred rate, he said, in exchange for a first-right purchase on her milk and cheese output at prices he would set. He said it with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin at an angle that suggested he was doing her a kindness. She asked him what price he had in mind. He named a figure that was 12 cents on the dollar below the going rate at the Leavenworth market. He noted that she was one woman alone, that winter was coming, that the cost of getting milk and cheese to Leavenworth on her own would eat any difference she imagined she saw. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, which was a thing she had learned from Pavel, and which had the same effect on Horace Greer that it generally had on everyone. It made him talk more than he intended to. He added that he had heard the building at the center of her property was in questionable condition. He added that he had some connections with the county assessor, and understood that the property had been carried on the rolls at a figure that might bear revisiting, given the improvements she had made. She heard this last part carefully, and filed it, where she filed things she intended to return to later. She told him she would consider it. He left. She walked to Pavel's that evening. Pavel listened to the whole account without any expression that would help you read his interior. When she finished, he poured her a cup of tea and set it in front of her, and said, "A man who tells you he has a friend at the assessor's office while he is making you an offer is not making you an offer. He is showing you a weapon." She looked at the tea. "What do I do?" Pavel considered. "You move before he does, and you do not move quietly." She moved in November. She spent 2 weeks driving the routes she needed, visiting the Leavenworth buyer, the cousin, a creamery in Westport that had been looking for a cheese supplier for 2 seasons, and a dry goods merchant in the county seat who dealt in wool and had been importing goat fleece from Missouri at considerable expense. She came back with 4 signed letters of intent and a price list she had written out in her best hand, and she walked into the office of the county assessor, a Mr. Dolph Abrams, and laid the letters on his desk and explained plainly and without heat the current and projected value of the operation at the East Platte Road acreage, with the precise figure she expected the property to carry on the rolls. The letters were not only the commercial record of her operation, they were a demonstration. She was not one woman alone with 70 acres of cane. She was a supplier with 4 customers and an order book. Abrams, who was a cautious man and not a cruel one, read the letters carefully. He asked a few questions. He wrote some numbers. He set the assessment at a figure that was fair and that bore no resemblance to the revised figure Greer had implied. When she stood to leave, Abrams said quietly that it was a solid piece of work for any operator. She thanked him. She kept her face level until she was outside. What she felt walking back to her wagon in the November cold was something she could not easily name. It was not triumphant, and it was not relieved, though it contained both of those things. It was closer to settled, like a foundation going into ground that has been properly dug. Underneath all of it, underneath the letters and the numbers and the careful driving of muddy November roads, was the knowledge that she had not let Greer set the price of her labor or the terms of her independence, and that was a thing nobody could carry back from her once she had won it. She had one more piece of business. In December, Horace Greer came to the fence line again, and this time his manner was different. The warmth was gone. He told her flatly that she would regret not taking his arrangement, that the winter would be harder than she anticipated, and that he had it on good authority from people who knew farming that a woman operating a goat dairy alone in this county had no practical future. She let him finish. Then she told him she had contracted her output through Leavenworth, Westport, and the county seat, and that she would not be requiring his feed at any rate, as she had made arrangements with a supplier in Junction City who had offered better terms and free cartage. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. He went red. He said something about the count of her animals. How had she built to that number so quickly, he wanted to know. And it was in the phrasing of that question, the too specific curiosity of it, that she understood who had been feeding rumors to the assessor's office in the first place. She did not say so. She let the silence do what silence does. He left, and she did not see him at her fence line after that. The winter was, in fact, harder than she had anticipated, but she had anticipated hard, so the hard that arrived fell within the range she had budgeted for, which is the only kind of hardship that does not break a person. 3 feet of snow in January locked the Platte Road for 11 days. She fed the herd from the stores she had laid in from October onward, cutting it close in the final week, but never going short. Tobias Fenn appeared at her fence line every morning that winter before school, in the dark and in the cold, and together they carried hay and broke ice from the water trough and counted heads, and she taught him slowly how to read an animal's condition from its coat and its posture, and the quality of its attention. He was a serious student. He had the gift of patience, which was the most important gift, and she told him so, and he received this with the solemn satisfaction of an 11-year-old being told a true thing. January broke in February. February was cold but honest about it. March brought mud that sucked at your boots 3 inches deep, but it also brought the first kids, which arrived with the casual abundance of a thing that has been properly prepared for. 37 kids in 3 weeks. Della was up every night for those 3 weeks, and Tobias was up on the weekends, and Pavel came down twice and said nothing critical, which was as close as Pavel got to high praise. When the count was final, 37 kids, all healthy, no losses, she sat in the depot with a lamp and her ledger, and looked at the numbers and said it again, as she had said it, looking at the cleared floor the previous autumn. There it is. Spring in Sutter's Crossing arrived the way springs arrive after hard winters, which is with a relief so physical you can feel it in your sternum. The town was beginning to recalibrate, the way towns do when the evidence becomes undeniable. People who had watched her buy the land and shaken their heads were now walking slower when they passed the Platte Road cut, trying to see through the fence. The Blackberry cane was gone from 60 of the 70 acres. The depot was visible from the road now, stone walls clean and repointed. The old oak sign frame above the door rehung and waiting for a sign Della had not yet painted. The herd grazed on the first spring grass, which had come in surprisingly strong on ground that had been under cane for 40 years, because 40 years of leaf litter and root die-off had built a topsoil that Horace Greer's dismissal of clay subsoil had not accounted for, and Della's reading of the seep spring had predicted. The land was not marginal. The land had been waiting. The first delivery went to Leavenworth in April. 8 milking dues in excellent condition, which the cousin, a man named Archibald Stearns, who was red-faced and hearty and entirely converted to the enterprise the moment he looked at the animals, purchased at the agreed price, and then immediately asked about the following year's availability. She told him she expected to have 12 to 14 does of that quality the following spring. He said he would have a letter to her by May. She shook his hand and drove back to Sutter's Crossing, and the next morning she went out at 4, as she always did, and began the work. The cheese went to Westport in May, the first 12 wheels of a hard-rind variety she had been making since February, and aging in the cool stone interior of the depot, which maintained a temperature that was, she had discovered, nearly ideal for the purpose without any modification. The Westport Creamery buyer's name was Mrs. Harriet Pell, a woman who tasted food the way a jeweler looks at a stone, with complete attention and no expression whatsoever, until the assessment was complete. She cut a sliver from the first wheel Della unwrapped and put it in her mouth and chewed it slowly. And then she looked at Della and she said, "Where did you age these?" Della told her. "Stone Depot, spring-fed cellar temperature, Sutter's Crossing, Mrs." Pell cut another sliver. "Tell me you have a full year's supply coming." She did not yet, but she would, and she said so, and Mrs. Pell wrote her a contract on the spot, which she countersigned and kept, folded, in the inside pocket of her coat, where she kept things she intended to keep. It was June when the drought came, not to her land. To Sutter's Crossing and the surrounding county, the summer of that year came without rain from the middle of June through the end of August, 11 weeks of iron sky and cracked earth and dying corn, and the town that had been recalibrating quietly began to recalibrate loudly because it had no choice. Crops failed, wells dropped. The creek that fed most of the eastern farms ran to a seep by July and went dry by August. Della's spring ran clear and cold through all of it. She had not advertised this. She had not needed to. The first neighbor to come was a woman named Ruth Casper, who had 3 children and a kitchen garden, dying in the heat and enough pride that it cost her something to walk down the Platte Road and knock on a gate she had walked past with skeptical eyes for 2 years. Della opened the gate. She showed her the spring. She showed her the water troughs. She gave her 2 full buckets to carry back and told her to come back each morning, and she would have 2 more. Ruth Casper looked at her for a moment that held several years of complicated feeling in it, and said, "I was unkind to you when you first came." Della said, "Come back tomorrow." That was all. It was enough. Over the following 6 weeks she gave water to 7 families from the seep spring, carrying it herself in the early mornings before the work, and the spring never faltered. She kept the full herd watered. She kept her garden, which she had planted in the cleared acreage in May, growing, slowly, carefully, using the water she could spare. She did not raise the price of her milk or her cheese during the drought, though she could have. The families whose wells had gone dry were buying from her at the going rate she had set in spring, and she held it there, and the town noticed. A town notices when it is being treated fairly, particularly when it has not always been fair in return. It is a slower kind of noticing, and quieter, but it goes deep and it stays. It was in August, at the worst of it, that Horace Greer's feed store showed the first sign of real trouble. His suppliers in Kansas City had not committed early, and his own creek lot had gone dry, and his stored grain was lower than his customers needed. He raised his prices in the third week of August. 3 families who had been buying from him came to Della's fence line that week, asking if she had hay to sell. She had cut and stored hay from her own cleared acres in late June, more than she needed, because she had read the sky in May and made a calculation. She sold it at her spring price, same as she had set in June. Not 1 cent more. Greer heard this, as he heard everything, and his reaction was the reaction of a man who has been outmaneuvered so quietly that he did not see it happening until it was complete. He came to her in late August. He did not come to the fence line this time. He came through the gate, which required her to have opened it, which she did, because she was not interested in enmity for its own sake. He was a smaller figure than he had seemed at the fence line in the full clear light of her land. He said without preamble that he had not expected her to succeed. She told him she knew. He said that the assessor business. She waited. He stopped. He started again. He said he had made some comments in passing that he should not have made. She looked at the depot behind him, at the repointed stone and the clean roof line, and the oak sign frame waiting for its sign. She looked back at him. She said, "I am going to need a regular supply of mineral supplement for the herd this winter. I understand you carry it." He blinked. She named a fair price. "Is that manageable?" He said it was. They shook hands, and the handshake was the thing, the actual thing, more than any speech or confrontation could have been. Not reconciliation exactly. Something more practical. A town has to go on, and the people in it have to go on, and Della Marsh had never wanted enemies. She had wanted land, and the freedom that land makes possible, and she had both. Pavel came to the farm on a Sunday in September. He came slowly with his cane down the Platte Road, and Tobias Finn met him at the gate and walked with him across the cleared acres and through the last section where the goats were still working the final fringe of cane at the far northeast corner. Pavel did not speak much. He looked at the spring. He looked at the depot. He looked at the 40 acres of cleared ground where the first short growth of perennial grass was coming in like a rumor of abundance. He stood for a long time at the edge of the last section and watched the goats, and Sunday, who remembered him, or seemed to, pressed her peculiar ears against his knee. He put one hand on her head. "Well," he said at last. That was all from Pavel. But she had learned to read him, and the one word was a complete sentence, and the complete sentence was everything she had needed to hear. She painted the sign that September. She had been turning the name in her mind all summer, the way you turn a stone to see its best angle. The sign she put up on the oak frame above the depot door read, "Platte Road Dairy, established 1887. She used black paint on a plank of the same white oak as the floor, which she had cut from a wide board with a knot that had made it unusable for anything else, and therefore perfect for this. Tobias held the ladder. Pavel sat on a stump nearby and did not offer advice, which was how she knew the name was right. The sign went up on a Thursday. By Sunday, 3 people from town had walked down the Platte Road to look at it. By the following week, 2 more families had put in orders for the winter cheese supply. By October, when the rains came back and the creek rose and the iron summer broke at last into the cool and the color of a real autumn, the town of Sutter's Crossing had completed its recalibration, though no one called it that, and no one stood up and made a formal acknowledgment of what had happened, because that is not how towns work. What happened was subtler and more permanent. The way people said her name changed, the way they stepped aside on the board sidewalk, but differently now, not to avoid her, but to make room. The way the hardware man asked her opinion about the Fleming place going to auction in the spring, genuinely curious, the way you ask a person whose judgment you have decided to trust. She was 29 years old. She had 70 acres, a herd of 52 goats, a stone depot that had been buried for 40 years and was now a working dairy, a spring that had not failed in the worst drought in a decade, 4 commercial contracts, and a sign she had painted herself with a plank that had a knot in it. She was sitting on the depot steps one morning in October, in the early light, before Tobias arrived and before the work of the day properly began, when she heard Pavel's voice in her memory as clearly as if he had been sitting next to her. Land is not what it looks like. Land is what it is capable of, and you cannot know that until you have taken off what does not belong there. She had thought, when he first said it, that he meant the Blackberry cane. She understood now that he had meant the cane, and also the assessment, and also the low opinion of other people, and also her own uncertainty. All of it was cane. All of it could be cleared by patient, methodical work. All of it, once taken away, would reveal what had been there the whole time, waiting for someone with the stubbornness and the observation and the willingness to run the arithmetic in the dark and believe what the numbers said. The goats moved across the last clear acres in the early October light, Sunday leading, the herd flowing behind her in that unhurried tide that Della had watched for 2 full years now and never gotten tired of watching. The spring ran in its channel. The depot stood clean and solid at the center of everything. The sign caught the low light and held it. Della Marsh rose from the steps, pulled on her work gloves, and went to find out what the day required of her.